I've always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green right when you finally decide to just run it. So, of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week I had heard the phrase, "character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out of my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and that all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me so I could just get out of there. But I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her and she mentioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said,
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
I should stop and give you a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and kind of an indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was 60-something years old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, like she was disconnected for the moment. That made my skin crawl. And after a brief, maybe about a second debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and that I couldn't give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again.
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
This time, I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her I had a curfew and had to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again.
"My boyfriend beat me up."
At this point, the light changed and I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since.
"You made the right decision."
Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do or if there were more people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me ever since, and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. I was on an equestrian team throughout middle school with about 9 other girls. My coach's name was Deborah, and one of the most awesome things about Deborah was that she'd always take our teams on reward trips or events. Trips included outings such as movies, water park dates, or just barn sleepovers. This particular trip was a trail ride overnight. We were ecstatic as trail overnights were only a summer thing and it was one of the first ones of the year. Basically, a trail overnight was a weekend that we would go on a 3-day-long trail ride. We'd pack a bag or two, meet up on Friday morning at the stable, load up our horses and bags into the 3 trailers, and be on our way. That was exactly how it happened this particular trip. Everything went exactly as it should have, and we set off to a trail near the Sleeping Bear Dunes, as I live in rural Michigan. Things got odd a few hours into the trip. We had all left at about 7 in the morning, so that left us with plenty of daylight to do fun stuff after we got settled into the campsite. Deb had us all saddle up to go along the Lakeshore Trail. Once everyone was in the saddle, we set off on a narrow, single-file-only trail that wound through some woods and eventually would lead us to an overlook of the beach. I was completely in my zone. My horse, Aries, was not. It was like he and a few other horses were sensing something that nobody else did. But we chalked it up to being in a new place that we had never camped before. Being that Aries was a Mustang, I thought maybe his wild instincts were kicking in after a few years of being domesticated as well. At about 7 o'clock that evening, while Deb and the stable hand Carla cooked up hot dogs and the rest of us had to come back from swimming, I decided to take Aries out for a quick trot and a loop around the campsite in hopes to calm him down. I grabbed my helmet and mounted up, not bothering to grab reins or saddle up, and just tied the lead rope to the other side of his halter. The ride went how I expected it to, with Aries acting up, although this time his behavior was different. He didn't just seem agitated, he seemed distressed, like something was really scaring him. I looked around and couldn't see a thing. No deer, no bears, no other horseback riders or mountain bikers or anything. I decided to go down a little trail that would wind back up at the campsite after about 5 minutes rather than just going in a loop. This is where it hit the fan. We had been going for about 2 minutes on this little trail when I started feeling funny, like we were being watched. I turned around and nobody was there. At one point of the trail, we came across a big boulder, and this was where Aries stopped completely. No amount of nudging or encouragement budged him. He absolutely refused to go any further. I slid off his back and tried pulling him to no avail. That's when I noticed where his eyes were focused. He wasn't looking at me, but over my shoulder. Slowly, I turned around and saw a tall, dark figure about 50 yards away, maybe less, standing ahead of us on the trail, not moving, even though I'm sure he heard us. I didn't know what to do. Was he a hiker? It was obviously a man, but he had no pack, no bike, nothing. He was holding something in his hand though. A walking stick, maybe. I didn't want to bother him or go near him as his presence had given me the creeps. I whispered to Aries that we were going back and slowly climbed on. As soon as I was situated and I looked back at the man though, my heart dropped. The figure had turned towards us, watching. I could tell because I could faintly make out the zipper of his jacket. There was no doubt he had seen and heard us, so there was no point in trying to be subtle. I offered a wave, trying to signal I was out of there and wouldn't be a bother. Aries was more than happy to oblige. When I looked back again, my heart dropped even further and I froze. The figure was getting larger. The man was chasing us, running at full speed. I saw what was in his hand, a machete? It couldn't be, but it sure looked like some kind of weapon. I said Aries' name loudly in fear, and he knew what I wanted. He kicked into overdrive as the man had caught up to about 10 yards away from us. Mustangs are fast, and Aries was no exception. That made hanging on without a saddle a bit difficult, but I somehow knew that if I fell, my life was over. And just my luck, I did fall. Aries had put some distance between us and the man to where I could no longer hear or see him, but it didn't take long for the machete guy to come within hearing range. The man came up over the hill of the trail and spotted me immediately. I knew I was doomed. The man started towards me, and before I could bolt, I heard the thundering sound of hooves speeding in my direction. The man, although I couldn't see his face beneath the hood of his jacket, I could tell he was looking behind me. I turned to and had to dive out of the way. Aries was speeding towards the man in like a freight train. I couldn't believe what I saw. Before the guy could dive out of the way, Aries struck him with full force and trampled him, making the guy yell out in pain. He lay there limply. More than likely a bone or two was broken. Aries was big for a Mustang, and being hit and run over by any horse isn't going to leave you without injury. Aries disappeared over the hill for a second, then came back and ran the man over a second time. He stopped long enough for me to scramble onto his back and we sped to the campsite. I told Deb and the rest of the group that we needed to call the police and get the hell out of there. As soon as I told Deb, she had us pack our stuff up and get in the trailer and trucks while she called the police. They didn't take too long to arrive, as there were usually some scouting around the area we were in. I told them everything that had happened, and that the man may still be laying where we had left him because Aries had trampled him pretty badly. We didn't stick around long enough to find out, but we learned that the guy I had encountered had previously been arrested for assault with intent to kill. How he had gotten into the woods, I'll never have any clue. I do know that I owe my life to my horse, as I wouldn't be here to tell this story had I not been with him. People say horses are dumb animals, but I think Mustangs are different. I think if Aries had not been wild before, he wouldn't have been able to recognize the threat. Anyway, that's my story. If there are any fellow riders out there, or even just hikers or mountain bikers, whatever you might do on the trail, I recommend you don't go do it alone. When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was in a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29 and her name was Beth. She was tall and wide, and she had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed nice, although a little quiet, but she seemed to like me and agreed to let me move in. So far, so good. My first night there, we went out for pizza, and that's when I could tell that something was a little bit off with her. Throughout dinner, she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged it off with a thanks. I mean, I looked nothing like Shia LaBeouf, so it just didn't make any sense to me. When we got back home, she asked if I had seen her room yet. I said no, and she took me to see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She had even printed out photos of him all over her mirror. She owned all of his movies. I mean, I didn't know what to make of it. It was creepy. The whole night she had been saying I look like him, and now it's obvious to me that she's obsessed with the guy. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend any time together, really. She would come home from work and practically run to her room. She would spend the whole night in there. She had this really creepy high-pitched giggle, and I would hear her giggling through the walls at night. I wondered what the hell she could possibly be doing. Occasionally, she would come out and talk for like 2 minutes, and then she would always be slurring her words, so I suspected she was drinking a lot. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything, and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her and be surprised and say something like, "Hello, Beth." And then there would be this long, awkward pause, and she would just give out her creepy, high-pitched giggle. It was uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out of my bedroom and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth over and over again, and every time she turned the bolt, she mumbled my name.
Max. Max. Max.
Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name really freaked me out, and it doesn't help that she kinda looks like a bigger version of the girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and tried to sleep. One night, I was watching Gladiator and she stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an uneasy segue into the topic, but I just said sure and then awkwardly sat back to listen to her. 10 minutes into her story and she was extremely riled up. She was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried that the neighbors were going to call the cops, and she wasn't listening to me when I was asking her to lower the volume. Amidst all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and she yelled that she'll slit his fucking throat. That was a big game changer. Suddenly, I had no idea what this girl was capable of. I mean, she was practically a stranger, and everything I had seen was becoming alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she told me thanks for listening and started doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast and went to my room to go to sleep. I had a pretty unsettling feeling about being in the house with her. And what's worse is that there was no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act as like a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on my light, shouting at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was so drunk and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed and yelled at her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning when I went out into the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw that one of her steak knives was on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms. All I could think about was her saying she would slit that guy's throat. I confronted her about it, and she said she didn't remember trying to push my door open. She said she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I had enough. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and moved out. About a month after I moved out, she contacted me. I was at the movies and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned my phone on. And to my shock, I received 40 plus text messages that she had sent me over the past 2 hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between, "Hi, how are you?" to "I fucking hate you." It was insane. I didn't respond and I never heard from her again. I always wonder if I hadn't set my dresser in front of my door, would she have quietly crept into my room and slit my throat? It freaks me out. For a little backstory, I'm trans. I try to present as male as best as I can, but it's still pretty obvious that I'm biologically female. I have short hair and I wear guy clothes, but I have a very unmistakably female face. I also live in a very religious area, so it's not a very common or accepted thing. One of our neighbors is a priest, but he's very accepting and his house is a bit like a second home for me, because I think of him like one of my grandparents and he sees me as a grandson. Anyway, I was walking home from school during the winter a few years ago and it had started snowing. Needless to say, it was pretty damn cold and I was miserable. The wind felt like it ignored my clothes and chilled me right to the bone. It was hard to hurry because the freezing wind made my muscles really stiff. I was only maybe a quarter of the way home when a car slowed down and pulled up next to me. It was just a little old lady. She looked nice enough, and at this point I was willing to do anything to get out of walking another 3 miles in the cold, so I got in when she offered to give me a ride. It felt a hell of a lot better in that car than it did to walk. She was very nice at first. She prattled on about how her grandchildren went to the same school as me, talked about how lucky we were to live in such a nice Christian community, and so on. When she started on about being a good Christian, about how much she loved Jesus, I was a bit uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. After all, even though I'm not a Christian myself, it isn't my place to say anything about religion. Believe what you believe and all that. She'd just been nice enough to give me a ride, so I didn't want to offend her. When she started talking about Leviticus, that's when I knew I had messed up by getting into her car. She started going on and on about gay people and how they're just confused, how man should not lay with man, and so on. We were getting close to where I was going to have her drop me off. When I mentioned that she could drop me off there, she looked over at me and didn't say anything. She didn't slow down either. I was starting to get nervous. We passed the point I'd told her about. I looked over at her and said something along the lines of, "You can let me out here." She gripped the steering wheel really hard and said,
"I can't let you out. You need me."
I asked her what the hell she was talking about and she turned to me.
"Your short hair. I knew I needed to help you when I saw it. You're a sick girl. You need to let go of the demon inside you."
I tried to cast aside the discomfort of being called a girl and stumbled out something about just liking short hair, having a boyfriend, anything that would make me seem a little bit more innocent in her eyes. But it didn't look like she believed me. I wanted to cry as I watched the drop-off point get further and further away. I begged her to let me out, promised that I would go to church, repent my sins, as long as she let me out and let me go home to my family. She screamed at me that she hated dykes and that she was going to call her son to help her, quote, fix me. At that point, I knew I needed to get out. I grabbed the handle and unlocked the door, only to feel my hopes sink as the electric lock kicked in and relocked it. She was still screeching about how I just needed to be with a man and it would fix me. That accepting God's truth would fix me. It might sound ridiculous to be afraid of an old Christian lady, but I was terrified. I was so scared of what would happen if I didn't get out. I took my chance and rolled down the window as fast as I could and made a jump for it. I landed on a pile of rocks and my breath was knocked out of me. I could hardly move. Everything in my body hurt horribly, but I knew I needed to get out of Dodge before she decided to come back. I got up and limped into my neighborhood. As soon as I came to that old priest's house, I snapped out of the stupor I was in and was hysterical. I banged wildly on the door until he let me in, and I cried uncontrollably while he called the police. I was taken to the hospital after I told the police what had happened. The jump from that car broke my femur in 4 places and cracked both my knees. It amazed doctors that I was able to make it to the priest's house in the condition that I was in. I've never seen that lady again or her car, but since then I never walked to or from school alone anymore. I can only hope nobody ever got into her car again.
So, I've been watching a YouTube series about deep web exploration. I won't name this series or the channel it belongs to. I'm not getting paid for advertisements. Anyway, I looked up a video on how to access said deep web. I did it fast and dirty, not much research on what not to do. Big mistake. Let me tell you right now, using Windows on the deep web is a bad idea. That much I did know. Easy to get hacked that way since it's the most prominent OS. I know you can boot up a live USB on a Linux clone OS. A simple Google search can tell you how to do that. It's not as difficult as it sounds. But I figured if my laptop gets hacked, I'm screwed. I can't exactly afford to just buy a new one right now. So I thought I'd be smart and use my Android tablet. What a genius, right? Yeah, I know. I'm an idiot. So a few VPN apps later and I'm surfing the deep web, looking around like a little kid in an adult store. I have no clue what any of it means, but I'm interested in it all. I'm aware you can find a lot of snuff in pedo rings, so I treaded carefully. Unfortunately, I stumbled upon one of the two. I'm not going to say which, but it made me sick to my stomach and I nearly quit then and there. In fact, I did, for a few minutes. I chalked it up to bad luck and resolved to be more careful. I'm not into that shit, not by a long shot. I'm not some deviant with fetishes for snuff or kids. Jeez, man. That image will probably be burned into my brain for the rest of my miserable life. Anyway, I'm browsing for a few hours and it's after 3 a.m. I've heard it's better to use the deep web at night. Less traffic that way. I found a few interesting sites. There's tons of religious stuff on there. You'd be surprised how often you find Satanists. Or at least people who claim to be Satanists. Most of the time, it's likely to be some edgy teenagers rebelling against their religious families. I won't get into my religious views, don't worry. It even has several of its own social networks and email services. No, thank you. You're begging to be stalked by some creep if you use one of those. Or better yet, get scammed by a catfish or honeypot. There are loads of conspiracy blogs as well. Both interesting and hilarious. Everything from Justin Bieber is secretly a reptilian member of the Illuminati to leaked files on human experimentation. There was even a guy who claimed to have stumbled across interdimensional travel via falling into an actual rabbit hole, as in a literal physical hole in the ground made by a rabbit. I'd say you can't make this stuff up, but clearly you can. I was serious about the human experimentation, by the way. You're going to want to avoid that kind of stuff. If you had any faith in humanity, you'd lose it in a heartbeat. My God, I hope that stuff wasn't legit. Gun shops, drug shops, celebrity nudes, pirated movies, hackers for hire, hitmen, virus programmers, script kiddies, stolen credit cards, you name it. There was one site that sold stolen US currency that was supposed to be marked for shredding due to age or poor condition. Seems like they got a lot of business too. No wonder the economy is in the toilet. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of legitimate stuff on there too. I visited the site of a really smart dude who was creating his own custom operating system, even had games and stuff on it. There was funny things too. A mock cult made for people named Dan was among my favorites. The people that weren't maniacs seemed to be open-minded, if a little paranoid. Then I came across a site that supposedly gives you access to the webcams of people's personal laptops. I was curious. I shouldn't have been, I know. I'm not expecting to see some cam girls here. Just some slack-jawed people staring blankly at their screens while watching Let's Plays or some shit. And that's exactly what I saw. Neckbeards, teenagers, old men looking confused, the works. Here's me laughing at unsuspecting people. Then I saw myself. Ha ha, very funny, I thought sarcastically. It's tapping into my camera and trying to give me a good scare. It almost did, at first. Even so, I logged off. I kinda realized how bad what I was doing was. Not to mention how illegal it was. I went back to the clear web and watched some Netflix. Soon enough, I had all but forgotten about my deep web exploits. Then my Skype starts ringing. Another Skype number is calling me. I think maybe it's one of my friends trying it out. After all, I have been pestering one of them for a while to get on Skype so we can chat while playing games on Steam. So I pick it up. At first there was silence. Then I heard a voice. A man's voice. He sounded like he was an older guy, 50 plus. "Looking good," he said. Without a second's hesitation, I hung up, deleted every deep web related app on my tablet, shut down and restarted my router. I have no fucking clue how that guy got my Skype number. And to be quite honest, I don't want to know. All I know is, if you're going to use the deep web, I beg of you, for your own safety, do more research than I did. Talk to someone who has experience in setting up a proper VPN or some other kind of anonymity. You're sure as hell not going to find it on fucking Google Play.
My name is Corey, and I've spent a lot, and I mean a lot of time camping, hiking, and hunting. I've seen all kinds of predators, and I've been in some sticky situations. Everything from a tornado heading my way to being tailed by some bears, so I don't exactly frighten easily. This past July, I was out camping near my family's farm in western Iowa, along with my girlfriend Alexa, my best friend Jason, and his new girlfriend, Samantha. Samantha actually had never been camping before, let alone more than a mile off the trail in the middle of a forest. She was understandably nervous, but we were watching out for her. We do have to watch out for prairie rattlers, poison ivy, and even mountain lions in this part of the state. We made camp in a clearing on top of a small hill with a few trees, but we were deep in the woods to be sure. We arrived to make camp, eat, drink, and went to bed by midnight. Nobody had any injury besides a few mosquito bites. Everything was going according to plan until suddenly I woke up to the sound of Samantha screaming at the top of her lungs. I just couldn't believe how loud she was screaming. It was actually insane. I woke up, I guess at the same time as Alexa, grabbed my light and my Glock and ran out. I told her to stay in our tent just in case. Jason was already trying to comfort Samantha, and she was talking, almost babbling about something huge walking through camp and scratching at the tent and making a terrible sound. I told her it could have been a coyote or even a mountain lion. What little food and trash we did have was outside of the camp area, so that wasn't an issue. But I assured her that I would stay up and light the fire again. That I would take turns with Jason watching the fire because our movement and the fire should scare anything away. This seemed to comfort her, and she actually went to sleep in with Alexa. Jason and I both stayed awake talking quietly, watching the fire and checking around camp for tracks and signs. We couldn't see anything obviously wrong or suspicious. It certainly could have been a mountain lion, and this did have me on edge with the girls there. About 30 minutes had passed and Jason walked just out of the firelight to take a leak. He was off to my left, my tent across the fire in front of me and Jason's tent behind me. There, off to my empty right, I saw something and heard a large crunch. Jason heard it also and was practically still pulling up his pants running towards the fire. "What the hell was that? That is big," he said. I know, it could be a big cat. Better get your 44 out of your bag too and get that bright tack light, I told him. He returned with those items and we waited to illuminate whichever area we heard more movement from next. Then we heard a crunch and a snap. More movement almost directly behind us. We stood up simultaneously and spun around, turning the brightest light on. For just a second, we saw what almost looked like a gorilla-sized and shaped figure disappear back into the trees. At this point, I'm trying to keep it together and Jason is just frozen. I tell him to snap out of it and that we need to get the fire to grow. Once the fire is larger, we both need to take a position, one in front and one in the back of the tent to protect the girls. We heard this awful grumbling and growling sound for the rest of the night. I have never heard anything like it. And large crunching and snapping sounds continued to emanate from the woods behind Jason's tent and really all around us. Periodically, we would see something move either to our left or right in the clearing just outside the trees. I kept the fire going. I actually had the fire pretty enormous by the end of the night. As soon as the sun started coming up, we packed up. On our way out, we saw large prints in the mud down by a small stream at the base of the hill we were camped on top of. I can't really say anything other than the fact that they basically looked like a huge man's prints. The thing we saw was definitely not a man. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was going to hurt us. I don't know if it was Bigfoot. Frankly, I don't want to know. The way I see it, it's really not relevant because I was thinking it was a mountain lion initially. Those are also dangerous. I won't let this stop me from camping. Sometimes I guess you just hear scary things at night in the woods. Because scary things do live in the woods. I guess that's just part of the adventure.